EMP Series, Day 157. The two men from the MC were camped in the woods, outside the home of Tyler Hobbs. It had rained on and off all night. They couldn't have a fire for risk of being seen, and they were cold and miserable. The one currently on watch woke the other just after first light, when three men left the house and started up the van. They rolled down the driveway and headed toward the main road. In town, Buddy and the other members were just waking up as well. They slept in a mezzanine in an old abandoned warehouse. Their night was somewhat unpleasant as well, but at least they were dry. They had plans to all meet up later this afternoon, upriver out of town where they camped the other night. All the evidence that could be collected from the train site, the scene of the murders 2 nights ago, was gathered yesterday. Major Stillman had released the train and told the conductor that they could return to their home station today. He assigned 2 soldiers to accompany them for security reasons. The van pulled into the alley next to the diner, and the 3 men got out and went in. Yesterday, when the 2 men came to town, only one left to go back home. One remained in town to gain intel on troop movements and take notes of the comings and goings of the constable. Nobody noticed this fact except for Buddy Tanner. In fact, the group had been rotating people to spend the day in town for this purpose quite regularly. Today, when they were done with breakfast, 2 of the men went over to the trading post to get supplies. The 3rd member of their group blended into the crowd on the street and eventually took a spot on a bench on the train platform. He would move around periodically to avoid suspicion, but was never far from the area around the post and the encampment of soldiers adjacent to it. When Buddy saw this, he told his men to pack quickly. He said, "Let's go, we gotta move out." They slipped quietly out a back window and down along the outside of the wall of the warehouse and crossed over into another alley, which led to a back road. From there, they moved quickly and quietly down the road until they came to the opposite end of the alley that the van was parked in. They made their way up to the van and checked the passenger door. It was unlocked. They got in and crouched out of sight behind the front seats. Carl Fairley was in his office. He arrived early, as he did most days. Upstairs, Major Stillman watched out his window, looking toward the camp where his troops lived. He smoked a cigar and watched the activity there. Lieutenant Saunders was with a detail of soldiers that were bringing wood, as well as the conductor and the engineer, back out to the train. George Henderson and Leroy McMillan were upstairs in the boardroom, discussing their agenda. There was a board meeting scheduled for noon, and Pastor Sharps and Ish Patel were currently on their way to town, accompanied by Dalton and Josh and Steve. Greg's new security protocol called for 2 men pulling security during all trips to town. Because of the fact that both most recent board meetings were cut short by attacks from the citizens of Liberty, Greg ordered a 3rd man along today. When Tyler Hobbs and his man got in the van, he turned the key and fired up the willing engine. At that moment, Buddy Tanner, who was crouching behind the driver, pulled the slide back on his .45 and stuck it hard into the rear of the driver's seat and told both men not to turn around. As his man chambered around in his pistol as well, Buddy said, "Real easy now. Just put her in gear and head back the way you came in. Let me caution you that I know where you came from, and if you head in any other direction, I'll kill you both." The van moved slowly out of town up along the river. When they came to a spot close to where their camp was, Buddy ordered the driver to pull off onto a dirt drive that led down along the river, an access road used by fishermen and canoers back in the day. They proceeded down and out of sight of the main road. When they got as close as they could to where the men had camped 2 nights ago, Buddy ordered them to stop. "Now what?" asked Tyler Hobbs. "Now we wait," replied Buddy. "Wait for what?" questioned Tyler. "You know the soldiers and the constable do regular patrols up here through this area. They're bound to come across us here." "Huh, I doubt that," said Buddy. "If I was you, I'd hope they don't. Or we might just feel obligated to tell them how we saw this very van driving out to the train site the other night, and how we heard shots, and then saw you come back and head up that gravel road up yonder a piece. I'm sure they'd love to hear all about that. I heard in town yesterday that 2 soldiers got murdered up there that night. Y'all know anything about that?" Buddy asked. Tyler and his man looked at each other, but said nothing. "I really don't want to have to turn you over to the law or the military," Buddy said. "I've got plans for you all. You're going to be a big help to us." He and his man both laughed. Tyler Hobbs and his man were not laughing. When Buddy's 2 men returned from the Hobbs homestead, they filled them in on all they saw. They estimated 7 men and 2 women at the house. 4 men, now that Tyler and the other man were here in the van, and the 3rd man left behind in town. Buddy laid out his plan to take control of the homestead. With Tyler and the other man bound and placed in the rear of the van, they waited until dark and headed out toward the gravel road that led up to Tyler's house. Just before they passed through the gate, Buddy stopped the van briefly to let 2 of his men out. Buddy shut the lights off and waited there long enough to give his men time to work their way up through the woods to the rear of the house. Buddy's man sitting in the passenger seat said, "Okay," as he heard the tone on his watch alert them that the allotted time had run down. Buddy started the van back up and started up toward the house. He left the lights on to make it difficult for the guard to see his face inside the van. After a moment, the guard got up out of his seat and walked over to the top of the steps. "Everything okay in there, Tyler?" he asked. When he didn't get an answer, he started down the 3 steps to the driveway. He walked over to the driver's door. By this time, the other 2 men with them were situated on the back porch, ready to breach the door and enter the house. Buddy had his head turned and leaned downward as if he were retrieving something from the rear floor of the van, so the approaching guard could not see his face. When the guard was right outside the van, Buddy turned with one swift motion and plunged his knife right into the man's throat through the open window. He wrapped his arm around the guard's neck with his hand over his mouth. He was dead before he had a chance to scream. Buddy released him, and he fell to the ground. Buddy and his man walked silently up the front steps until they reached the door. They waited several minutes until again a tone on his partner's watch alerted them that it was their cue to enter the house. Both teams entered simultaneously through the front and back doors, with weapons drawn. The 2 in back quickly and quietly subdued 2 of the women who were in the kitchen sitting at the table. They gagged them and bound them to their chairs with duct tape. Buddy stood in the hall watching the stairs while this happened. When they were secured, all 4 men ascended the stairs single file. At the top, 2 men went left and 2 men went right. To the right at the end of the hallway was a man sitting in a window, watching the rear yard with a rifle at his side. When Buddy started toward him, A floorboard creaked. The man turned to face them, grabbing for the rifle. Buddy fired one shot, which hit him square between the eyes. He fell dead on the floor. The sound of the shot brought Samantha and the remaining 2 men out of their rooms. Buddy and his men quickly disarmed them without incident as they entered the hall. One of the men had managed to get off a shot, which missed its mark. Almost as soon as he fired, a rifle butt came smashing across his face, knocking him unconscious on the floor. The children, asleep in another room, hadn't even woken up. He bound Samantha and put her in the adjacent room. Everyone else was tied up and placed in the living room. The dead man was removed and placed in a barn with the man in the driveway. Buddy ordered 2 of his men to go through the entire house and barn, make sure there was nobody else on site. When they returned, one of the men nodded to Buddy, and the other said, "I'm glad we ain't sleeping in the rain tonight." Buddy managed to smile and said, "Take first watch in front. I'll take first watch over the prisoners. 3-hour shifts." He looked at the other 2 men. "Get some sleep," he said. He placed Samantha in the room next to the children so that if he or his men heard the kids stir throughout the night, they could cut her loose and send her in to check on them. He didn't want to scare them if they came out and found strangers in the house. Buddy also informed his men of the last man in the group who was left to spy in town. "We don't know how or when he's coming back," Buddy announced. "Stay alert," he cautioned. Buddy Tanner and his men now had a base of operations.